Hello, everybody. This is John Stern, and today's lecture will be on the historic artists of Laguna Beach. Just briefly to tell you about myself, I was born in Casablanca. I was the founding director of the Irvine Museum and the only director from 1992 to 2016. I have both American and French citizenship. And I wanted to show this picture for this lecture. It was taken at a museum reception at the Irvine Museum. And there is, from the right to the left, Dr. Peter Keller, the president and director of the Bowers Museum, whom I have known since the mid-1980s. In the middle is James Irvine Swindon, president of the Irvine Museum. And then I'm on the left as director of the Irvine Museum. So this lecture is on Laguna Beach and its historic artists. This is a diseño, which is an old Spanish-Mexican survey map. It was made prior to American occupation of California, which was in 1848. And this is the type of map that they used to determine the boundaries of these very large ranchos, which some of them were 20, 30, maybe 40,000 acres. In this case, it's the Rancho San Joaquin, which made up a good part of the Irvine Ranch. And what you're looking at is essentially the area around Irvine. And on the right, there are three little lakes and a big inlet. That's the back bay. And there's a little house there and a corral, so there were cattle in the area. Then the mountains are the San Joaquin Hills in the foreground, and then very off to the right edge is Laguna Canyon with two lakes. The original name of Laguna Canyon was Cañada de las Lagunas, which is Spanish for the Canyon of the Lakes, and it's one of the few freshwater lake sites in Southern California, so it's very unusual. And those lakes are still there, and that's how Laguna Canyon got its name, and that's how the city of Laguna Beach got its name. Laguna Beach was homesteaded in the 1870s, which means that the very first people could move in and actually claim a plot of land, and if they developed it, the plot were 160 acres, they could eventually keep it. It became their property. And most of the people in Laguna Beach that did that, developed it by planting eucalyptus trees, which was taken to be an improvement. So that's one reason why there's a lot of eucalyptus trees in that area. So this is the beach in 1887. You can see there's really no Pacific Coast Highway. Very few houses, mostly tents, because people would stay there seasonally. Mostly in the summer, they'd put up a tent very close to the beach, and they would enjoy being there, and then they would pack and go home. This is the original Laguna Hotel. It was opened about 1896. It had 30 rooms and 2 bathrooms, and it was where most people stayed when they came to Laguna. You see the coach in the foreground. They would pick you up at the station at El Toro, which was the nearest station, train station, and bring you through Laguna Canyon Road to the hotel. Most people don't know that Laguna Beach had a pier, and this pier was used to offload ships. The original pier was sometime in the 1880s, and it got destroyed by a big storm. Then they put up another one. It got destroyed by a big storm. They lasted about 15, 20 years. This is the one that was up in 1910. This is right off Heisler Point. To the left is Heisler Point, to the rock, and on the right are the bird rocks that you can see. Heisler Point is right there next to Las Brisas, and you can And there's a cupola there. You can sit down, you can enjoy the ocean. So there were piers, but there's no need for piers anymore. This is a typical street in Laguna Beach in the 1920s. Very few houses. The roads weren't paved. And again, you see lots of those eucalyptus trees in the background. Then finally, in 1926, the Coast Highway was paved. Parts of it had to be moved because the original Coast Road didn't work out, so they moved some of the road to make it what is today the Pacific Coast Highway. It was dedicated in 1926 when it came through Laguna. The Coast Highway started up north and worked its way south, and then it got to Laguna in 1926, and then it continued and eventually would reach San Diego. But in 1926, the section that went through Laguna Beach was open, and they had Douglas Fairbanks and his wife Mary Pickford do the ceremony. So there you see Fairbanks dressed up like a blacksmith. He's got an anvil, and he's about to cut that cable, and that would open up the highway for general use. So with the opening of the highway, it made it a lot easier to get to Laguna Beach from places such as Los Angeles. And from the very beginning, Laguna Beach was noted as an artist colony. This is an early postcard dating sometime in the early 1930s, and it features the beach, the rocks, the hotel, and then in the foreground, there's a whole bunch of plein air painters, outdoor painters. So Laguna was from the very beginning a haven for artists, and it became a very thriving artist colonies in the early 1900s, and it's continued to do that. The first known artist to come and paint and exhibit in Laguna Beach was an artist named Norman St. Clair. St. Clair was born in England. He was trained in architecture and watercolor painting in a traditional English style of watercolor, which is very dry brush, very detailed, very tight little lines. He came to Boston in 1887 and then eventually came to California in 1895. He discovered Laguna Beach and came and painted in 1902. He had an exhibit at the old hotel. That was the first exhibition of paintings in Laguna Beach. So he's a very interesting historic artist. He is a watercolor painter, and again, this is the English style, which is very tight, very photographic looking. Much later on, there's the California watercolor style, which gets really wet. It's a wet on wet brush. This is a dry brush, and it goes for a lot of detail. Here's a view of the coast early in the 1900s. Another view looking back towards what would be now downtown Laguna Beach. Notice there's no houses on the hills. There's no houses anywhere. And then this interesting painting, which is a road. It appears to be the Canyon Road, the Laguna Canyon Road, which was the most common way of getting to Laguna Beach. The stage would pick you up at the train station and then bring you through Laguna Canyon. This is artist name is George Gardner Simons. Simons was born in Chicago, and he trained at the Chicago Art Institute, and he came and visited California in the 1890s. He was a good friend of William Wendt, who lived in Chicago at the time and had no knowledge of Laguna Beach, and Simons brought him to Laguna on several occasions. They painted and then would return to Chicago. And he pretty well introduced several of the artists, and we'll show you later, to Laguna Beach. He loved Laguna Beach. He was primarily a snow scene painter. That's what his reputation is back east in the Berkshire Mountains. And he had a studio in New York, but he also set up a studio in Laguna Beach in 1903. And he turned to painting the ocean, which is quite different from his regular snow scenes. And this is the rocks and waves in Laguna Beach. This is a large painting, 40 inches by 50 inches, which is in the Irvine Museum collection at the University of California, Irvine. And here's one looking inland towards Mount Baldy, painted about 1900. This would be part of the San Gabriel Valley, and as you can see, there's only one or two little farms. There's very little there, just a lot of space and a lot of wildflowers. William Wendt, who was his friend and came with him in the 1890s, they also traveled to England together, and they were very close friends from Chicago. But Wendt came and also took to Laguna Beach, and he lived in Chicago until 1909 when he moved to Los Angeles. He was a founder of the California Art Club, then served as the second president. The first president was not an artist, he was a banker. But William Wendt took over and really made it into a functioning artists club. He opened a studio in Laguna Beach in 1918 and settled there permanently in 1923 with his wife, Julia. Julia Bracken Wendt was a wonderful sculptor. This is an early view of South Laguna, looking towards downtown Laguna at the top of the painting. This is dated about 1918. Here's a very early view of Crystal Cove. There's nothing here at Crystal Cove. This is the way the Native Americans saw it for thousands of years. And in this view of downtown, looking towards downtown Laguna Beach, painted in 1930, Wendt was a very spiritual painter. He rarely had houses in his paintings. I've selected these because it is the subject of Laguna Beach, but if you look at his work in general, there are very few times that you see houses, and very rare that you see a human being. Most of them are beautiful landscapes, and there's some great examples of those at the Bowers Museum, some beautiful large landscapes, very spiritual, very naturalistic. William Swift Daniel was, again, another friend of George Gardner Simons, and he too was encouraged to come visit Laguna Beach, which he did in 1905. He was a Boston painter, and he loved Laguna Beach and kept returning, and finally built a home in 1914 and lived here the rest of his life. This is a view of Laguna Beach, where there are very few structures and lots of open fields. And then, of course, the beach was the big attraction to these artists, because when you're at the beach, you get this intense light, which brings out colors and makes them very strong. And the reason the light is intense is because the sun bounces off the ocean and is not absorbed by forest or trees or flowers or land. It comes to the viewer very strong, very powerful, so that you can see a lot of really great colors. Anna Hills is perhaps one of the most important artists in Laguna Beach. She was from Ohio. She studied in Europe for a while and came to Los Angeles in 1912. She came to Laguna the following year, 1913. She was perhaps the most important teacher. She was also one of the founders of the Laguna Beach Art Association, which I'll talk about later. And she served as president on 2 occasions and was very instrumental in forming the club into what it was at its highest, and into raising the funds needed to build the gallery, to buy the land and to build the gallery. She loved to paint with a small palette knife, which you see in the photo, but then I also included one, just in case you're not familiar with a palette knife. It's just a way of applying paint like you spread peanut butter with a knife. It isn't. She didn't often use a brush. She preferred to use that little palette knife, and her paintings end up like this, with a lot of little flat areas. It looks almost like a mosaic because they're applied in tiny little flat bits with a shiny surface. This is a view of Laguna Beach when she first came, and this is from 1915. This is a view of Laguna Canyon, and it's unusual because it's mostly brush. So it's a large painting. It was easier to paint the small paintings with palette knife because, there's 3,000 brush little strokes with a knife, but in a large painting, you could end up 10,000 or more. So she did a lot of the larger areas in brush, and the detail very often is in the palette knife. Here's a palette knife painting of some trees in Laguna Canyon. This is Frank Kuprian, who was born in Brooklyn. He studied art and music. He lived in Europe for 11 years studying. And when he returned to the United States, he lived briefly in Florida, in Texas, and in California in 1912. He soon discovered Laguna Beach and settled there in 1914. He was one of the founders also of the Laguna Beach Art Association. Kuprian is very interesting because he loved painting the ocean. He had a home that was right next to, he was right on the beach in what would now be next to the Surf and Sand Hotel. And he was always seen in the evening painting small little sketches of the ocean and how the light changed with every 20, 25 minutes as the sun went down. So he is the ultimate painter of the seascape in Laguna Beach. Here's one called An Evening Symphony, and you see the sun catching the water as it's about to set and creating all sorts of brilliant effects. And then in the evening, as I said, he loved to paint little paintings, this is one of them. It's a sunset painted very quickly, and that's Catalina Island in the distance, and the sun is setting right there in the saddle. Those two mountains form a saddle, and from Laguna Beach you can see it in very bright, colorful sky and very, very dark ocean. Edgar Payne is one of the great California Impressionist painters. He was born in Missouri. He is essentially self-taught. He attended one course at the Chicago Art Institute and left after 2 weeks because he didn't feel that he could learn anything. So he was a professional sign painter for many years and did decorations, did sets for theaters. He met his wife, Elsie Palmer Payne, who was also an artist, when he was in San Francisco in 1911, and they got married in 1912. Together, they toured Europe, and in 1922, they stayed in Europe for 3 years, and then they returned 1928 for just a few months. He loved to travel, and he is best known for his painting of the Sierra Nevada mountains. This is an early painting of Edgar Payne, done in 1911. Here's one later, after he settled in Laguna in 1918. Loved to convey that light and that powerful surge of the ocean. You see essentially the whole cycle of the tide here. It's coming into the rocks, it's hitting it, and then in the foreground you're seeing it ebbing back into the ocean. This is painted in Capistrano nearby. And here's one of his Sierra Nevada mountain paintings that he's best known for. This is Mount Alice, which is now called Temple Crag. This is his wife, Elsie. Elsie was from Missouri. No, she was from San Francisco, sorry. And she was trained as an illustrator, and they met, and they fell in love, and they got married. They settled in Laguna in 1918. She would accompany him wherever he went. She loved to paint in gouache. Gouache is an opaque watercolor. Traditional watercolor is transparent. You could see the pencil lines underneath. Gouache has been thickened up, so you can't see what's underneath, and it covers up whatever else you painted over it very well. So you can see she's a lot more modernist. She's not really focusing on the representational, three-dimensional depth of the painting. She likes a heavy outline. She likes flat areas of color. She didn't want to compete with her husband, so while he painted in oil, she painted in gouache. Here's another one of her paintings. They were living in LA. She went to Beverly Hills and painted this beautiful house. In 1932, they had a serious disagreement and they separated. They didn't get divorced. They separated. Edgar went to live in his house and Elsie went into her house. And they stayed that way until Edgar got cancer. And 2 years before he died, she stopped what she was doing. She took Edgar in and she took care of him until he died. And after he died in 1946, she made it her point to show his paintings, to make him be recognized as an important artist that he is. Here's one of her later paintings. This is done in oil. This is after Edgar had died and after they'd separated. And it's a park in Tahunga, little kids playing. And here's another oil. Again, there's a lot of modernist tendencies here, a lot of flat areas of color, a lot of stylized forms like the flowers and the fountain in the background. So in 1918, a group of artists led by Edgar Payne in Laguna Beach decided that they were going to hold an exhibition. And the exhibition was held in July 27th, 1918. They invited a lot of their friends and they had this exhibition and it was very, very popular. There were only about 35 artists, but a large number of people came. When they formed the Laguna Beach Art Association 3 months later in August, they had about 30 artist members, but over 70 patrons. And in this photograph taken in the following year, you see several artists. There's more that I haven't identified, but most of the people are patrons. They're people that live in Laguna Beach, that love the art, that bought the art, and that felt that they were a kindred part of the art society in Laguna Beach. So it was a very popular event, the Laguna Beach Art Association. Edgar Payne was elected president for the first term. And they held their first exhibition in the abandoned town hall. This is where the town council met, and then they got a better place. So the artists took it over and they exhibited there for several years. They fixed up the inside. This is what the display looked like the following year in August 1918. Some of these artists are quite recognizable. You could see some paintings by Jack Smith and by Anson Pudoff, so very, very beautiful. Some of them are very large painting. In the 1920s, especially when Anna Hills was president, they set about raising money to buy a piece of land from Mr. Heisler, who owned a good part of the coastal Laguna Beach. And they had several exhibitions where they sold these miniature paintings. And you see in the upper left is a little surf painting by Gardner Simons. And then in the upper right is by William Wendt. It's called Early Moonrise. And on the back of the William Wendt, there's all sorts of interesting data. It says donated to Laguna Beach Art Association by the artist William Wendt, November 1922. So these were held periodically, these exhibitions. They raised money in other ways. They got donors, and eventually they did get enough money to buy the piece of land that Mr. Heisler offered to them at a significant discount. So the lot was bought in 1926. Then they went about building the gallery, and that opened in 1929. This is the Laguna Beach Art Gallery, and it is the present site of the Laguna Art Museum. They expanded the building, so it takes up most of the lot, and that's what is now the Laguna Art Museum. So Other artists continued to come and live in Laguna. This is Roy Clarkson Coleman. He came from Illinois. He had lived in Texas and studied in Paris. In 1913, he moved to Pasadena. In 1917, he moved to Santa Ana, and the next year he came to Laguna Beach. He also was fascinated by the ocean, and most of his work are seascape, but they're very gentle, they're very soft, they're kind of an opalescent looking seascapes. He also did some landscapes, in this case, a stormy day on the coast. This is the artist Karl Jens, who was born in Germany. He was trained to paint murals. He moved to New York in 1901 and painted murals there. And then in 1910, he came to Los Angeles. And in 1918, he settled in Laguna Beach. This is one of his great works. It's a large 40 by 50-inch painting, which is in the Irvine Museum collection at the University of California, Irvine. And it is called America the Beautiful in 1918. This is Jens' statement that even though he is of German origin, he is profoundly American. And he paints this gorgeous view of the coast in Laguna. And there's a lot of lines in this painting that are not immediately obvious, but by looking at it, you're drawn to looking at the flag, the American flag. And these are the lines and the subtle direction. So Jens wants you to look at the coast and eventually look up and see the flag, because the title, America the Beautiful, is what this painting is all about. This is another one of his paintings. He was a bit of a mystical painter. This is painted in Laguna Canyon. It's called, again, the meadowlark. The meadowlark is in the upper left area there, the yellow bird on the branch. But that's Mr. Jens himself painting en plein air, painting outdoors. William Griffith came from Kansas. He had studied in Paris. He was a good friend of Benjamin Brown. And Benjamin Brown was he was in fact the first Impressionist trained professional artist to come to Southern California. He arrived in Pasadena in 1896. And he encouraged several people to come and paint in Southern California and to paint in Laguna Beach. So William Griffith is one of these that was urged to paint there. He came in 1920 and he settled there. That's a picture of his wife, Ida, and their dog, Babe. I was friends with some of the family members, and they opened up their photo albums to me. So I have some very interesting photos of William Griffith and his family. Griffith lived in a house directly across the street from what is now the Laguna Art Museum. This is on the coast side, and it's on Cliff and Coast Highway. And he had this great, beautiful truck that he used as a mobile studio. And in 1925, he's painting his own house, and he includes that truck because that was a very important part of his life as an artist. So he could travel and he could just stay where he was for days at a time, living in the truck and painting. He was an excellent pastel painter, and he loved to sit at the beach, mostly at Divers Cove, which is a popular beach in Laguna, and he would paint the people. And he loved the colors of the parasols, the umbrellas, the bathing suits, the light. Notice the shadows are applied in purple, violet, which is good sound impressionist color theory. But he also is a great oil painter. And this is an early view of the Laguna Canyon done about 1928. This is Joseph Kleitsch, a Hungarian artist who came to the US in 1902. He settled first in Cincinnati, then to Denver. He was trained as a portrait painter, and he was an excellent portrait painter, and he painted portraits of important people all over the world. In 1907, he and his wife moved to Mexico City, where they lived for 2 years because the president of Mexico and his family, they kept him busy painting their portraits. Returned to Chicago in 1912, was a very important artist in the Chicago art community. And in 1921, he arrived in Laguna Beach. He died in 1931, so the last 10 years of his life were spent in Laguna. When he got to Laguna, he realized that this was a charming little artist colony that was going to change. It was going to become modernized. So he set about painting what he could of what the little art community looked like at the time, knowing that it wouldn't be that way for long. This is a 1922 painting of what is now downtown Laguna. See what it looks like today. That hill in the background in Joseph Kleist's painting is completely bare. Now it's full of houses. The street, the highway was paved. It's off to the left in this painting, but you see Laguna Canyon was indeed a stream, and it did have water in it. And when it rained, it sometimes flooded. So that stream now has been contained by concrete walls, and you can still see it, but it's generally devoid of water. There's another one of his paintings, 2nd Street, which was later named Glenary Street. This is Glenary Street. We're looking down Glenary. We're standing on Legion Avenue, and there's a photograph. I do believe it's the same eucalyptus tree. That big major tree is there in the photograph, the modern photograph. This is a view of the village looking south towards Dana Point. He loved the idea that it was a charming little community, but he was concerned that things were changing. And this is downtown Laguna Beach, just before the highway was paved. You see the highway in the foreground is a dirt road. And looking through the trees, you see the drugstore, which is one of the most painted structures in the town. It's the old Rankin drugstore. And it's just a charming little village that just changed and became much more modern. This is George Brandriff, who came from New Jersey. He came to California in 1913, specifically to enroll at USC, and he did. He studied dentistry at USC for 4 years, graduated as a dentist, set up a practice in Hemet in the desert, and began taking art lessons. In 1923, he was started to take art lessons with Anna Hills, and he loved painting. And within a few years, he decided to give up dentistry altogether and become a full-time painter. And he did that in 1928 after he settled in Laguna Beach. And he has a very tragic life because not long after he came to Laguna in the early 1930s, he contracted a very severe cancer. And the pain was so great and there was very little they could do that in 1936 he committed suicide. But he painted some gorgeous paintings, and this is the old Dory Fish Market in Newport, where fishermen would go out early in the morning in their rowboats. They would fish and then come back at about 1 or 2 and sell fresh fish to the people. This is one of his moody paintings. It's a very powerful painting. It's called Sailing. But you see there's 2 ships in the left foreground. There's one in the center and deep inside. And they have these beautiful sails. They're pointing upwards. And as you look upwards, your eyes are captured by that cloud that twists around and continues out of the paintings, suggesting some kind of a heaven, of a future. So in this painting, the artist is dealing with his coming mortality. This is Donna Schuster. She was born in Milwaukee and trained at the Art Institute of Chicago, and she also studied with some of the Boston painters, did mostly figures and portraits. She studied with William Merritt Chase, who's a bold, vivid impressionist. She came to Los Angeles in 1913, and she began visiting in Laguna Beach as early as 1917. She was a bit of a modernist. She decided that there was more to painting than just direct representation of the subject. So she began altering the colors, altering the forms, not in a bold way, but just kind of leaning towards a much more modern approach. In 1922, she joined a group of 7 other artists that exhibited as modern artists in Los Angeles. It didn't last long. There was very little demand for their paintings, so the group disbanded. But she did visit Laguna, rented a home, a studio there. This is a painting done in 1917. I strongly suspect this is Santa Monica Beach, but she did love to paint on the beach. Again, you see these very bold colors. These are not colors that you see in nature, but they're positioned, their pattern to create a very strong contrast. And that intensifies the sense of light. If you look on the foreground in a shadow, there's really beautiful blues and violets spotted by orange and by reds and by browns. Here's one of her very impressionist painting. This looks a lot like what William Merritt Chase would have painted. It's called In the Garden. The French artists, the French impressionists like to dissolve the forms, and here you see that. The woman, her face is very tightly painted, but the background just dissolves into all sorts of colors and lights. This is typical of French Impressionism. American Impressionists like to keep the form solid. So they painted everything, solidly. They didn't dissolve it like what you see here. Here's one she did at the Mission San Juan Capistrano. The Sacred Gardens is that little garden that's behind the bell wall. And most people, they know the bell wall because you could see it from the outside, but inside there's a small little garden and there's a fountain there. This is a mother and daughter team. The mother is Eleanor Colburn and the daughter is Ruth Peabody. Eleanor Colburn, here you see her portrait painted by the daughter, by Ruth Peabody. She was from Ohio. She came to Laguna with her daughter. They both got divorced. They were married, they got divorced. They decided to live together in Laguna Beach. They had a home on the Coast Highway. She was very modern in her approach, Eleanor. She liked to deal with an approach called dynamic symmetry, which is a very difficult way of creating a composition where there's a lot of math involved, a lot of geometry, a lot of lines. And it's an approach that a lot of artists dabbled in, but it was very difficult. And they simplified it, they used it for their own purposes. And I'm going to show you, here's one by Eleanor Colburn. It's called Bathing Baby. This too is in the Irvine Museum collection at the University of California. And you see there's a very strong form to it, but there's also very active lines. There's all sorts of lines in this. And as you're looking at the painting, you see mother bending over and her arm is completely enclosing the baby, so that baby is protected. And you're looking at the mother as a pyramidal shape from the ground, but if you look carefully, she's sitting on the bench, and that's a soap dish on the left. So you're looking also down the pyramid from the ceiling. So there's multiple viewpoints to this painting. So again, she and her daughter, they were very, very intent on exploring new ways to paint. Here's one of her paintings, Little Brother Pedro, which is in Hilbert collection at the Hilbert Museum in Orange. And it's a mother, a baby, and an older child. But if you look at it, there's just this complete network of lines. All these lines, they're drawn first on the blank canvas. She patterns her lines. She knows what she's going to do. She knows where everything's going to be. And then she paints. following those lines and keeping them active. So it's a very active composition. But you can see that there's a lot of scientific knowledge, and those just a few of the lines. There's a lot more that I have not pointed out. This is by Ruth Peabody. This is painted in Laguna Beach. They're looking out their window. This is at 2160 South Coast Highway, and that's Laguna through the open window. But it's a work table. There's some cineraria. There's yarn, and somebody's been knitting. She was, again, trained as a sculptor, the daughter, Ruth. And this sculpture is at Coast Highway and Cliff Drive, in that little island right across the Laguna Museum. And it's a fountain that's designed to allow the dog to have a drink. So below that is the fountain. The sculpture stands atop the fountain. But in the fountain below, there's an area where the dog can get water. Here's one of her abstract pieces. Ruth Peabody, being the younger, the daughter, she was much more into modernism, into abstraction. And again, she also was a strong student of dynamic symmetry, of geometry. And here are some of the lines in this painting. So this approach to painting by doing a very scientific and geometric background to it is a way to try to make a more solid, a more stable composition. This is Thomas Hunt. He was a Canadian artist who studied with his father, and he also studied at the Pennsylvania Academy in Philadelphia in 1916. In 1924, he came to California, lived in Los Angeles, and then in 1927 moved to Laguna Beach. Hunt was a very modernist artist. This is one of his earlier pieces, and you can see there's a lot of forms of blocks and triangles, and very substance oriented in terms of forms, like Cézanne would do, or some of the modernist later Cubists would do. And this is, again, one of his early works. And as he matured and kept painting, he got very, very modern. He simplified the forms. The space is flat. There is no three-dimensional depth. The intent of this painting is to have colors and placed where they are placed to create an emotional response. So again, the colors are simplified. The boat is just one solid color blue, the house one solid yellow. And then they're very, very simplified forms that look like the houses you'd buy in a Monopoly game. But that was what he wanted to do. He wanted to eliminate a lot of this realism in favor of color placement. He's exploring the role of color in terms of creating an emotional response in the viewer. This is the artist Arthur Ryder. He was from Chicago. He studied in Chicago at a small private school. And when he was there in 1911, he attended a lecture by the great Spanish Impressionist Joaquin Sorolla, and he was immediately converted to what Sorolla was painting, which was very bold, very colorful Impressionism. With a lot of younger artists that became professionals in the late 20s, early 30s, it was very difficult to sell paintings during the Depression. But at the same time, the movie studios switched to color film. So a lot of these artists ended up working for the studios, and Arthur Ryder did. He ended up working for MGM and some other studios most of his life. He did background scenes for some very important paintings. In this case, this photograph shows him doing the backgrounds for the painting, the movie Forbidden Planet that has Robbie the Robot in it. But again, he was very much into color. This is a very strong color painting that reflects the ideas of Joaquin Sorolla. This is a painting called Near Laguna. Many years ago, Joan Irvine Smith and her son James Irvine Swindon and myself were at an auction, And I said, oh, you got to look at this painting. Arthur Ryder's a wonderful artist that nobody knows. And we looked at it, and yeah, it's great. Look at all the light, but it's near Laguna, and it's got coconut palms in it and a thatched roof house. So we didn't know where it was. It looked like somewhere in Mexico, but we bought it anyway. And later, when we were working with the Crystal Cove Conservancy that Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Swindon were very much involved in, we studied some of the photos and realized that it had been used as a movie set for South Seas paintings for years. And there's a photograph of it very similar to the painting. So it is Crystal Cove, it is Laguna Beach, and it is portrayed as the movie set where a lot of these movies, pirate movies, were filmed in the old days. Here's an Arthur Ryder of downtown Laguna Beach, the foot of Oak Street. This is in the Buck collection at the University of California, Irvine. And you see that Oak Street isn't even paved. And this is done very early on. They're very simple houses. He focuses on the light. The light is what he wants. And there's this very intense light as you're looking out to the ocean. Remember I said the light just bounces off the ocean without being absorbed. So it's coming right at you, and it's kind of blinding sometimes. Now I'm going to go quickly through some non-resident artists who visited but did not live in Laguna Beach. This is the artist Frederick Melville Dumond, who visited apparently just one time in 1911, but he painted some wonderful paintings. This is a painting called Miller's Cove, Laguna, done when he was here in 1911. This is again in the Irvine Museum collection at the University of California, Irvine. And it shows Miller's Cove, it's owned by Frank Miller, who owned a lot of property in Laguna. And it was later changed to Rockledge. So this is the community of Rockledge when there's only two houses in it. This is another view of Laguna, the coast by Frank Dumond. This one is in the Laguna Art Museum. William Lee Judson, a very important Southern California painter, born in England and came to the US when he was a child. He served in the Civil War and he returned to Canada after the war. He contracted tuberculosis and the doctors said he didn't have a long time to live. And they suggested he go to a warm, dry climate. So he came to Pasadena in 1893. And as you can see, he lived a long, long time after that. So it probably was bronchitis, maybe not even tuberculosis. But he is one of the important painters in Southern California. He was the first dean of the USC Art School. And he was the central figure in the arts and crafts movement in Pasadena. This is a view of the Coast Highway in Laguna Beach. This is an interesting painting, very close friends of the Wents, and he had them pose. William and Julia Went on the rocks. Benjamin Brown, we talked about, a very important Impressionist painting, convinced a lot of artists to come to Southern California. He came in 1996, lived most in Pasadena, but visited Laguna quite often. This is the Laguna Canyon Road, completely unpaved, and there's nothing there, just a road in a canyon. You're going to go through there, you're going to encounter the two lakes, and then you're going to get to the coast in Laguna Beach. Gavin Redmond, one of the important California artists, he was deaf and mute, but he was a terrific painter, and he did a lot of painting all through California. These two I'm going to show you are just two of the many he did in Laguna Beach. This is a beautiful study of the light and the waves on an overcast day in Laguna. And then a bright sunny painting of the beach with people enjoying themselves. Jack Wilkinson Smith came from New Jersey and moved to LA in 1906. Often came to Laguna Beach. He was a very, very important painter of seascapes as well. These are tide pools, in Laguna, possibly at Crystal Cove. And this is Jean Mannheim. He was born in Germany of Alsatian parents, so he spoke German and French. He came to the US in 1881 and moved to LA in 1908. This is a painting he did. I think that's Glen Eyrie Street, right there at Forest Avenue, but I'm not sure. And then Guy Rose, certainly the most important of the California Impressionists, trained as an Impressionist, also as a classical painter. He lived in Europe. He lived in Giverny for 8 years. Giverny is the village where Monet lived. And he returned to the United States just before World War I. These are some paintings he did in Laguna Beach. A beautiful hazy day looking across the coast. One of the coves in Laguna Beach, possibly painted on a bright sunny day, but he was one of these, like Monet, that liked to paint a series of paintings. These are paintings of that same cove that he did at different times. Sometime he would do 2 a day at different times of the day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. He would return, he would paint under different light conditions, very much like Monet and the French Impressionists. This is a lifting fog, Laguna Beach, done about 1917. And Laguna Rocks, low tide. You see in the background Gough Island, which is where the montage is today. So thank you for attending this lecture. I will be doing 2 more lectures, so please stay tuned and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for attending my lecture.